Some people go through life believing they're not meant to be chosen. Annie Colburn was one of those people, living alone in the Colorado mountains, convinced that love was for other women. Prettier ones, softer ones, ones who didn't have dirt under their nails and scars on their hands. The townspeople called her Gravel Annie when they thought she couldn't hear, and she'd learned to wear that loneliness like armor. But then Matthew Rigg showed up at her door, a broken-down ranch hand with kind eyes and a war-wounded leg. He wasn't looking for a wife, just a place to rest. Yet something about the way Annie tended to wounded animals and mended broken things, without complaint, made him want to stay. What would happen when a woman who'd never been chosen finally met a man who saw past her rough edges to the gentle heart beneath? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of snow down from the peaks. As Annie Colburn stepped out onto her cabin porch, a cup of bitter coffee warming her calloused hands. October mornings in the Colorado Territory came sharp and clean, the kind that reminded a person how small they were against the vastness of the mountains. She breathed deep, letting the cold air fill her lungs, and surveyed the small kingdom she'd carved out of wilderness and stubbornness. Her homestead sat in a natural hollow between two ridges, protected from the worst of the winter winds, but open enough to catch the morning sun. The cabin her father had built 23 years ago still stood solid, its chinked log walls weathered to a silver gray that matched the granite outcroppings scattered across her land. A lean-to barn sheltered her mule, Jasper, and the few chickens that hadn't yet fallen prey to foxes or her own poor judgment about predators. Split-rail fences marked off a vegetable garden that had yielded well this year, and a small pasture where she kept the goats that provided milk and cheese for her trips to town. It wasn't much by most standards, but it was hers. Every fence post she'd set herself after her father passed 5 years back. Every shingle she'd replaced when the mountain storms tore at the roof. Every morning she rose before dawn to tend the animals and mend whatever the previous day had broken. The work kept her hands busy and her mind from wandering down paths that led nowhere good. Annie had learned early that dwelling on what she couldn't change was a luxury she couldn't afford. At 32, she'd long since made peace with the fact that marriage and children weren't in her future. The mirror in her cabin showed her the truth plainly enough. A face too angular, a jaw too strong, hair the color of old leather that refused to hold a curl no matter how she tortured it. With rags and pins, her hands were scarred from countless repairs and her back straight from heavy lifting. She wasn't the kind of woman men wrote poems about or fought duels over. The townspeople of Millfield, 15 miles down the mountain trail, had made their opinions clear enough over the years. When she rode in for supplies or to trade her cheese and eggs, conversations died when she approached. Women pulled their children closer and men found sudden interest in their boot leather. The name Gravel Annie had started as cruel joke among the younger men, something about her being as rough and unyielding as the mountain stone. She'd heard it whispered behind her back often enough to wear it like a badge now, though it still stung more than she cared to admit. But solitude had its compensations. No one questioned her decisions or criticized her methods. She could rise when she pleased, work at her own pace, and speak her mind to the animals without worrying about proper feminine behavior. Her father had raised her like the son he'd never had, teaching her to shoot straight, think clearly, and rely on her own judgment. Those lessons had served her well in the years since his death. The sound of hoofbeats on the rocky trail that led to her cabin broke her morning reverie. Annie set down her coffee cup and walked to the edge of the porch, shading her eyes against the low sun. A rider was making his way up the switchback trail, moving slowly as his horse picked its way over the rough ground. Visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy, and this one was coming from the direction of town. As the rider drew closer, Annie could make out more details. A man, lean and dark-haired, riding a bay gelding that favored its left front hoof. The horse's coat was dull, with travel dust and steam rose from its nostrils in the cold air. The rider sat his saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd spent considerable time on horseback. But there was something careful in the way he held himself, as if movement caused him pain. He reached the flat ground in front of her cabin and reined in his horse, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning, ma'am. I'm hoping you might be Miss Colburn." Annie studied him for a long moment before answering. He had the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors, with lines around, his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind. His clothes were clean but well worn, the kind a working man might wear on his better days. Something about his voice, quiet, respectful, with a slight rasp, made her think of distant thunder. "I am," she said simply. "And you'd be?" "Matthew Rigg, ma'am. I was told in town you might have work for a man willing to do it." He shifted in his saddle, and she caught a glimpse of him favoring his right leg. "I'm handy with tools and animals, and I don't mind hard work." Annie had heard this before, though not often. Occasionally, drifters or men down on their luck would make the climb to her homestead, drawn by rumors that the mountain woman might hire help. Most took one look at her and decided they'd rather take their chances elsewhere. Those few who stayed usually lasted less than a week before the isolation, and her blunt manner sent them back down the mountain. "Don't get many applicants for the position," she said, allowing herself a small smile. "What makes you think you'd be different?" Matthew considered this, his dark eyes serious. "Can't say I would be, Miss Colburn, but I'm not looking for easy, just honest work and a place to rest my head. Your reputation for fair dealing precedes you." That surprised her. Annie had expected the usual stories. The wild mountain woman who lived like a man and had the temper to match. Fair dealing wasn't typically part of the legend that surrounded her name in town. And what reputation might that be, she asked. "Man at the livery stable said you pay what you promise and don't make a habit of cheating folks. Said you brought a sick child medicine in a blizzard 2 winters back. Wouldn't take payment for it." Matthew's horse shifted restlessly beneath him, and he gentled it with a quiet word. "That's the kind of person I'd be proud to work for." Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd forgotten about the Henderson boys' fever, the desperate ride through a late-season storm to bring him the herbs that might break it. She'd done what needed doing, nothing more. The fact that someone had remembered it, spoken well of it, left her momentarily speechless. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose we should talk terms. Light down and rest your horse. I'll put coffee on." Matthew swung down from his saddle with visible effort, his right leg not taking his weight smoothly. An old injury, Annie judged, the kind that left a man walking careful on uncertain ground. He moved to his horse's head, running gentle hands over the animal's neck and speaking in low tones. The bay nuzzled his shoulder in response, clearly accustomed to such attention. Annie watched him tend to his mount before seeing to his own comfort. In her experience, a man's treatment of his animals told you most of what you needed to know about his character. Matthew Rigg handled his horse with the same quiet competence he'd shown in conversation. No wasted motion, no impatience, just steady care for a creature that depended on him. "Your horse is favoring that front hoof," she observed. "Picked up a stone yesterday," Matthew replied, already reaching for the animal's leg. "Thought I'd gotten it all, but it's still tender." He lifted the hoof with practiced ease, probing gently at the frog with his fingers. "There's the culprit." Annie found herself moving closer, interested despite herself. She watched as he carefully extracted a small, sharp stone that had wedged itself deep in the soft tissue. The horse snorted and stamped, but stood still for the treatment, trusting his rider's hands. "You've done that before," Annie said, "more times than I care to count." Matthew straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. A lame horse can be the difference between reaching safety and spending a cold night with wolves for company. Something in his tone suggested he spoke from experience. Annie filed that information away with the other small details she'd noticed. The careful way he moved, the alertness in his eyes that swept the landscape before settling on her face, the position of his gun belt worn with the ease of long habit. "Come on inside," she said. "Coffee's getting cold and we have business to discuss." The interior of Annie's cabin reflected the same practical approach as everything else in her life. One large room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a bedroom partitioned off at the back. The furniture was simple but well made, most of it crafted by her father's hands. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a neat stack of split wood beside it. Shelves held her few books, her father's journals, and the various tools of mountain living: an oil lamp, a small metal box that held her mother's wedding ring, jars of preserved food, and the countless small items that made isolated life possible. Matthew removed his hat as he entered, running his fingers through dark hair that showed early traces of grey at the temples. Annie judged him to be somewhere in his middle 30s, old enough to have accumulated some experience, but young enough for the years to sit lightly on his shoulders. When she gestured toward the table, he waited until she'd seated herself before, taking his own chair, a courtesy that surprised her. "Tell me about this work you're looking for," Annie said, pouring fresh coffee into 2 metal cups. She kept her voice neutral, businesslike. No point in encouraging expectations that would only lead to disappointment on both sides. Matthew wrapped his hands around the cup, grateful for its warmth. "General ranch work, mostly. Mending fences, caring for animals, repairs on buildings. I've got experience with all of it," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'm not looking to stay permanent, Miss Colburn, just long enough to earn a stake for moving on come spring." "And where would you be moving on to?" Annie asked. "California, maybe. Or down to Texas. Haven't decided yet." He met her eyes across the table. "But I can promise you honest work for however long I'm here. I don't drink to excess, I don't gamble away my wages, and I don't make trouble for my employers." Annie studied his face, looking for the tells that would reveal a man's true nature. She'd developed a keen eye for such things over the years. The slight shift of gaze that indicated dishonesty, the defensive set of shoulders that suggested a violent temper, the restless energy of men who couldn't be trusted around animals or property. Matthew Rigg showed none of these signs. If anything, he seemed almost too careful, as if he was holding himself in check. "What kind of wages are you expecting?" she asked. "Room and board, plus $20 a month if the work suits you." Matthew's tone remained matter-of-fact. "I can sleep in the barn if you've got space, and I'm not particular about food." It was a fair offer, actually less than Annie had been prepared to pay. The work around her homestead was more than one person could handle properly, especially with winter coming on. There were fences to repair before the snow made such work impossible, firewood to cut and split, and a dozen other tasks that would go easier with an extra pair of hands. But hiring help meant giving up the solitude that had become her refuge. It meant having another person around to witness her daily struggles, her small failures, her unfeminine way of handling the world. Most men who worked for her eventually made it clear they thought themselves better suited to make decisions about her property and her life. The few who didn't try to take over usually left when they realized she had no intention of providing more than honest wages for honest work. "I'll want to see you work before I decide," Annie said finally. "You can stay tonight. Help me with morning chores tomorrow. If we suit each other, we'll talk terms." Matthew nodded. "That's fair. I appreciate the chance, Miss Colburn." Annie stood to refill their coffee cups, aware of his eyes following her movements. Not with the calculating look she'd grown accustomed to from men who thought her isolation made her desperate for company, but with simple attention to her words and actions. It was somehow both more and less unsettling than outright rudeness. "You can put your horse in the lean-to with my mule," she said. "Jasper's gentle enough, won't give you gelding trouble. There's hay in the loft and oats in the bin if he needs grain." "Much obliged." Matthew rose from his chair, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll see to him now if that suits you." After he left, Annie found herself watching through the window. As he led his horse toward the barn, he moved with the economical gait of a man accustomed to conserving energy, but she noticed how he positioned himself to keep his weight off that right leg. An old wound, she guessed, probably from the war, that had ended more than 15 years ago. Many men carried such reminders, though most tried harder to hide them. She turned back to her kitchen, surprised to find herself looking forward to tomorrow's work. It had been a long time since she'd had the prospect of competent help. Longer. Still, since she'd met someone who treated her with simple respect, rather than either mockery or false deference. Matthew Rigg might not stay long, but perhaps he'd be different from the others while he was here. Outside, she could hear him talking to his horse in the same quiet tones he'd used with her. The sound was oddly comforting in the mountain silence, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in the world. For tonight, at least, that would have to be enough. Annie woke before dawn to the sound of wind howling around the cabin's eaves and something else, a low, distressed whinnying from the direction of the barn. She pulled on her boots and coat. Without lighting a lamp, moving by feel through the familiar darkness of her home. October storms in the high country could turn deadly fast, and the sound of a horse in distress usually meant trouble. The wind hit her like a fist when she opened the cabin door, carrying with it the sharp bite of snow and the promise of worse to come. She pulled her coat tighter and made her way toward the barn, fighting against gusts that threatened to knock her sideways. The storm had blown in during the night, one of those sudden mountain tempests that could dump 3 feet of snow in as many hours. Inside the lean-to, she found Matthew crouched beside his bay gelding, speaking in low, urgent tones. The horse was down on its side, breathing hard and showing the unmistakable signs of colic. Sweat darkened its coat despite the cold, and its eyes rolled white with pain and fear. "When did this start?" Annie asked, dropping to her knees beside them. "About an hour ago," Matthew replied, his hands moving gently over the horse's distended belly. He was restless, pawing at his bedding. Then he went down and hasn't gotten up since. Annie had seen colic before, had lost her father's favorite, mare to it when she was barely 16. It was a cruel killer that could take a healthy horse in a matter of hours if left untreated. The gelding's breathing was shallow and rapid, his gums pale when she lifted his lip to check them. "We need to get him up and moving," she said. "How? Bad is that leg of yours?" Matthew's jaw tightened. "Bad enough, but not so bad I can't help my horse." Together, they managed to get the gelding to his feet, though he immediately tried to go down again. Matthew held the lead rope while Annie positioned herself at the horse's shoulder, and they began the slow, difficult process of walking him in circles around the small enclosure. The animal resisted every step, clearly wanting nothing more than to lie down and wait for the pain to end. "Talk to me," Annie said as they made their third circuit. "Keep him focused on your voice." Matthew began a steady stream of conversation directed at his horse, telling him about green pastures and sweet grain, about long summer days and the feel of sun on his back. His voice stayed calm despite the strain Annie could see in his face, the way his right leg dragged slightly with each step. Whatever injury he carried, this forced march was aggravating it considerably. They walked for an hour, then 2. Gradually, the horse's breathing began to ease, and some of the tension left his flanks. The dangerous bloat in his belly started to recede, and he began to show interest in his surroundings again, rather than focusing entirely on his internal distress. "I think we might have beaten it," Annie said, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cold. "But we need to keep him moving for another hour at least. Make sure it doesn't come back." Matthew nodded, though she could see the exhaustion in his face. His leg was clearly causing him significant pain now, but he hadn't complained once or asked for rest. She found herself respecting his quiet determination, his willingness to push through discomfort for the sake of an animal that depended on him. "Why don't you tell me how you came by that horse?" she suggested, knowing that conversation would help pass the time and might reveal more about the man who'd appeared at her door. "Won him in a poker game in Kansas," Matthew said, a slight smile, touching his lips despite their circumstances. Fellow claimed he was worthless, too old and too stubborn to be of use to anyone. Turned out he was wrong on all counts. Annie glanced at the gelding, noting the good bone structure and intelligent eyes that spoke of careful breeding. "Someone lied to you about his worth." "Someone lied about a lot of things that night," Matthew replied, his tone growing more serious. "But Charlie here has been honest company ever since, haven't you, old boy?" The horse nickered softly in response, and Annie felt something warm settle in her chest at the obvious affection between man and animal. In her experience, people who inspired that kind of devotion from their horses were usually worth knowing. As they walked, the storm outside intensified. Snow drove against the barn walls with increasing fury, and the wind began to make sounds like voices crying in the darkness. Annie had weathered many such storms alone, but there was something comforting about having another person present, someone to share the vigil and the worry. "This is going to be a bad one," she observed, listening to the wind's escalating violence. "Could last 2 or 3 days. "I hope I'm not imposing," Matthew said. "Storm caught me by surprise, or I'd have tried to make it back to town." "Town's 15 miles down a treacherous trail," Annie replied. "In this weather, you'd be more likely to freeze to death than find shelter. You're welcome to stay until it passes." Something in her tone must have conveyed more warmth than she'd intended, because Matthew looked at her with surprise. Perhaps he'd expected the brusque dismissal that she typically gave to men who overstayed their welcome. But watching him care for his sick horse, seeing his gentle competence and quiet determination, had begun to shift her opinion of her unexpected guest. By the time they judged it safe to let the gelding rest, the storm had reached full fury. Snow piled against the barn door in drifts that would make travel impossible even after the wind died down. Annie helped Matthew settle his horse with fresh hay and clean water. Then they made their way back to the cabin through snow that was already knee-deep and still falling. Inside, Annie built up the fire while Matthew removed his boots and coat. She noticed how carefully he moved, how he used the wall for support when he thought she wasn't looking. Whatever had happened to that leg, it was more than just an old sprain or break. "Sit down before you fall down," she said, her tone more gentle than commanding. "I'll make us some food." "I can help," Matthew protested, but Annie waved him toward the chair closest to the fireplace. "You've done enough for one night. Rest that leg." She busied herself at the stove, putting together a simple meal of beans and cornbread, while the storm raged outside. The cabin felt smaller with another person in it, but not unpleasantly so. There was something peaceful about the domestic sounds, the crackle of the fire, the quiet sizzle of food in the pan, the steady breathing of someone who wasn't demanding conversation or attention. When she set the plate in front of him, Matthew looked up with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Colburn, for everything tonight. I don't know what I'd have done without your help." "You'd have managed," Annie replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Colic was a 2-person job under the best circumstances, and these hadn't been the best circumstances by any measure. Charlie's a lucky horse to have someone who cares enough to walk the pain out of him. "He's carried me through worse," Matthew said quietly. "Seemed like the least I could do." There was something in his tone that suggested a story, but Annie didn't press. She'd learned that men revealed their histories in their own time, if at all. Instead, she settled into her own chair and focused on the simple pleasure of a hot meal on a cold night. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the cabin, an unexpected peace had settled over them. Annie found herself stealing glances at her guest, noting the way the firelight played across his weathered features, the careful way he held himself even in rest. Matthew Rigg was clearly a man with secrets, but they seemed to be the kind born of sorrow rather than malice. As the evening wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, Annie began to realize that this night had changed something between them. They'd worked together in crisis, trusted each other with something that mattered, and found a rhythm of cooperation that surprised them both. Whatever happened when the weather cleared, they were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were something else entirely, though neither was quite ready to put a name to it yet. The leather journal that held her father's final words sat on the shelf above the fireplace, a reminder of his advice about finding someone who could see past surface appearances to the person beneath. Looking at Matthew now, seeing the quiet strength and fundamental decency that the crisis had revealed, Annie began to wonder if such a person might actually exist. The possibility was both terrifying and strangely hopeful, like the first hint of spring after a long, hard winter. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping Annie and Matthew in a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Each morning, they checked on the animals together, wading through snow that reached past Annie's knees. Each evening, they sat by the fire, sharing quiet conversation and simple meals. Between times, Matthew occupied himself with small repairs around the cabin, while Annie went about her usual tasks, both of them careful to maintain a respectful distance while sharing the confined space. On the second day, Annie discovered Matthew in her kitchen before dawn, carefully shaping something from a piece of scrap wood with his pocket knife. He'd found an old branch in her kindling pile and was transforming it into something useful with the same quiet patience he showed in everything else. "What are you making?" she asked, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Matthew held up the emerging shape, a wooden spoon with a long handle and deep bowl, perfectly proportioned for stirring large pots. "Noticed you only had that metal one," he said. "Figured wood might be more comfortable for cooking." The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture caught Annie off guard. No one had made her anything in years, not since her father had whittled her a whistle for her 16th birthday. She watched Matthew's hands as he worked, noting their careful precision, the way he tested the curve of the handle against his palm to ensure it would fit comfortably in hers. "You don't need to," she began, then stopped herself. The automatic refusal had been on her tongue, the same response she gave to any gesture that might imply she needed help or care. But watching Matthew work, seeing the quiet satisfaction in his face as he shaped something useful from nothing, she realized he wasn't doing this because he thought her inadequate. He was doing it because making things, improving situations, seemed to be part of his nature. "Thank you," she said instead. "That's very thoughtful." Matthew smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she'd seen from him. "My pleasure, Miss Colburn. Always liked working with my hands." As the day progressed, Annie found herself paying attention to small details she'd never noticed before. The way Matthew moved through her space with careful respect, never presuming to rearrange anything or take liberties with her possessions. How he listened when she spoke, actually listened rather than waiting for his turn to talk. The gentle way he handled her animals, earning Jasper's trust within hours and coaxing her standoffish chickens to eat from his hand. That evening, he finished the wooden spoon and presented it to her with a shy pride that reminded her of a schoolboy offering his teacher an apple. The handle was smooth as silk under her fingers, worn to perfect comfort by his careful attention. When she used it to stir their dinner, it felt like it had been made specifically for her hands, which she realized it had been. "You have a gift for this?" she said, testing the spoon's balance. "Used to do more of it," Matthew replied. "Haven't had much call for it lately, being on the road and all." "What else can you make?" "Furniture mostly. Bowls, boxes, whatever folks need." His eyes took on a distant look. "Had a shop once, before the war. Thought I might go back to it someday, if I ever find the right place to settle." Annie filed this information away with the other small revelations that were slowly building her picture of Matthew Rigg. A craftsman, someone who created rather than destroyed, the kind of man who saw potential in discarded wood and took satisfaction in making useful things. It explained the careful way he held himself, the attention to detail she'd observed in his care of his horse. On the third day, as the storm finally began to exhaust itself, Matthew's legs seized up completely. Annie found him that morning struggling to get out of his blankets on the floor where he'd been sleeping, his face grey with pain and his right leg refusing to support his weight. "Just needs a minute," he said through gritted teeth. Sometimes it locks up when the weather's bad. Annie had seen similar injuries before, though never up close. Men came back from the war carrying all manner of damage, some visible and some hidden beneath their clothes or behind their eyes. Matthew's was clearly the kind that flared with cold and damp, the sort of wound that would remind him of its presence every day for the rest of his life. "Let me help," she said, moving to support his arm as he tried to stand. "I can manage." "I'm sure you can," Annie interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "But there's no shame in accepting help when you need it. Lord knows you've helped me. Enough these past few days." She helped him to the table, then disappeared into her bedroom to retrieve a small bottle from the collection of medicines she kept for emergencies. The liniment was something she'd learned to make from her father, good for the aches that came with hard work and harsh weather. "This might help," she said, setting the bottle on the table. "My father swore by it for his arthritis." Matthew looked at the bottle, then at her, something complicated crossing his features. "Miss Colburn, I appreciate the thought, but you're not comfortable with someone tending to your injury." Annie finished for him. "I understand that. But I also understand pain, and I can see you're in considerable discomfort. This is medicine, not charity, and there's nothing improper about accepting it." She left the bottle on the table and busied herself with breakfast preparations, giving him privacy to make his decision. When she next looked, the bottle was gone, and some of the tension had left Matthew's shoulders. They didn't speak of it directly, but something had shifted again. Annie had seen him vulnerable, had offered help without judgment or pity, and he had accepted it without surrendering his dignity. It was a delicate dance, this business of two proud people learning to trust each other, but they seemed to be finding their rhythm. That afternoon, when the wind finally died to a whisper and the snow stopped falling, they dug their way out of the cabin and assessed the storm's damage. Several fence posts had blown down, and the chicken coop had lost part of its roof, but overall, they'd weathered the tempest well. The real test would be the trail down to town. If it was possible, Matthew would be free to leave as he'd originally planned. Annie found herself hoping the trail would prove impassable for a few more days. "Looks like you're stuck with me a bit longer," Matthew said, echoing her thoughts as they surveyed the deep drifts that blocked the path down the mountain. "Trail won't be clear for another week at least." "Well," Annie replied, surprised by the lightness in her own voice, "I suppose we'll have to make the best of it." That evening, as they sat by the fire with the storm finally spent, Annie retrieved one of her father's journals from its place on the shelf. She'd read his words countless times over the years, finding comfort in his practical wisdom and gentle philosophy. Tonight, one particular passage seemed especially relevant. The heart recognizes what it needs long before the mind catches up. She read aloud, then closed the journal and looked across at Matthew. "My father wrote that after my mother died. Said it took him months to understand what he'd known the moment he met her." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Annie agreed. "Though I'm not sure I inherited his wisdom when it comes to understanding people." "Maybe understanding isn't something you inherit," Matthew said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's something you learn as you go, if you're lucky enough to find the right teacher." Outside, the mountain night was crisp and still, full of the profound silence that follows great storms. Inside the cabin, two people who'd been strangers less than a week ago sat in comfortable quiet, both of them beginning to understand that some kinds of weather change more than just the landscape. Sometimes they change the very ground you stand on, shifting the foundations of what you thought you knew about yourself and what you thought was possible. The wooden spoon sat on the table between them, smooth and useful and made with care, a small symbol of the unexpected gifts that could emerge from the most ordinary moments, if you were wise enough to recognize them when they appeared. The week that followed the storm settled into a rhythm that surprised Annie with its comfortable familiarity. Each morning, she and Matthew worked together, tending the animals and assessing storm damage. Each afternoon brought new projects, repairing the chicken coop roof, reinforcing fence lines, splitting firewood for the winter months ahead, and each evening found them sharing meals and quiet conversation by the fire, two people slowly learning to trust in the unexpected companionship they'd discovered. Annie had always been self-sufficient by necessity, but she found herself appreciating the efficiency that came with having a capable partner. Tasks that would have taken her days to complete alone were finished in hours with Matthew's help. More surprising was how naturally they worked together, anticipating each other's needs without spoken communication, moving around shared spaces, with the unconscious coordination of people who'd known each other for years rather than days. "You're different from what I expected," Matthew said one evening as they sat reviewing the day's accomplishments. "What did you expect?" Annie asked, genuinely curious. She'd grown accustomed to people's assumptions about the mountain woman who lived alone, but Matthew's opinion had begun to matter in ways she didn't fully understand. Someone harder, I suppose, more bitter. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The stories in town make you sound like you could chew nails and spit bullets." Annie laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Some days I feel like I could, but anger's a luxury I can't afford up here. Takes too much energy, and there's always work to be done." "Is that why you never married?" The question came, out quietly, tentatively, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to ask it. Annie was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth to share. She'd become adept at deflecting such inquiries over the years, but something about Matthew's manner, respectful, rather than merely curious, made her want to answer honestly. "Never had the opportunity," she said finally. "Men don't generally see past the rough exterior to whatever might be underneath. Can't say I blame them. I've never been what you'd call conventionally appealing." Matthew's expression shifted, and for a moment Annie thought he might contradict her, offer one of those polite reassurances that would mean nothing because they weren't based on truth. Instead, he surprised her with a different response entirely. "Maybe they were looking for the wrong things," he said quietly. "Some folks get so caught up in surface appearances they miss what actually matters." That evening, after Matthew had settled himself for sleep on the cabin floor, Annie retrieved a wooden box from her bedroom shelf. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had grown yellow with age, were the pressed wildflowers she'd been collecting since she was a girl. Her father had taught her the technique, showing her how to preserve the delicate mountain blooms between the pages of books. Over the years, the collection had grown to include specimens from every season: spring columbines, summer lupines, autumn asters, even the hardy little flowers that bloomed briefly in the snow. The next morning, she found herself showing Matthew the collection, spreading the delicate specimens across her kitchen table like fragile treasures. She'd never shared them with anyone before, hadn't even been sure why she'd continued the practice after her father's death. But something about Matthew's appreciation for the wooden spoon, his understanding of the value in creating beautiful things, made her think he might understand this too. "These are remarkable," he said, leaning closer to examine a particularly perfect columbine. "How long have you been collecting them?" 20 years, give or take." Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly self-conscious about this glimpse into her more romantic nature. "I know it's silly. It's not silly at all," Matthew interrupted, his voice carrying a conviction that made her look up in surprise. "They're beautiful, all of them. And this," he gestured at the careful arrangement, the obvious care that had gone into preserving each specimen, "this takes patience and skill. You've created something lasting from moments that would otherwise be forgotten." His words sent an unexpected warmth through Annie's chest. She'd thought of the flowers as a private indulgence, a reminder of the beauty that existed in her harsh mountain world. But Matthew saw them as something more, as evidence of her capacity for creating and preserving beauty, proof that beneath her practical exterior lived someone who valued more than mere survival. "My father used to say that pressed flowers were like captured memories," she said, carefully lifting a delicate larkspur. ways of holding on to the best moments of each season. What's your favorite? Matthew asked. Annie considered the question, her eyes moving over the collection. Finally, she selected a small, star-shaped flower, its pale petals still showing traces of the blue they'd been in life. Alpine forget-me-not, she said. They only bloom for a few weeks in late spring, up above the tree line where the snow melts. Last, you have to climb for hours to find them, and they're so small you could walk right past without noticing. But when you do find them, she paused, remembering the feeling of discovering that first patch of tiny blue stars scattered across a rocky meadow. It's like finding a piece of heaven someone dropped. Matthew was quiet for a moment, studying the pressed flower with the same attention he'd given to his woodworking. I'd like to see them someday, he said finally. The living ones, I mean. The simple statement hit Annie with unexpected force. No one had ever expressed interest in sharing the mountain experiences that meant the most to her. The idea of showing Matthew the secret meadows where the forget-me-nots bloomed, of watching his face when he saw their delicate beauty for the first time, sent a flutter of anticipation through her chest. They're not easy to reach, she warned. Steep country and the weather can change fast. I don't mind steep country, Matthew replied, his eyes meeting hers across the table. Sometimes the best things are worth climbing for. Later that morning, as they worked together repairing a section of fence damaged by falling tree limbs, Annie found herself stealing glances at her companion. The easy way he handled tools, the quiet competence with which he approached each task, the consideration he showed for her methods and preferences, all of it combined to create a picture of a man unlike any she'd known before. "Tell me about your war," she said suddenly, then immediately regretted the words. The question was too personal, too direct. Men didn't like to discuss such things, especially with women. But Matthew didn't bristle or deflect as she'd expected. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands continuing their steady work on the fence wire while he considered his response. "Spent 3 years with the Colorado Territory Volunteers," he said finally. "Saw action in Virginia mostly, some in Tennessee toward the end. Lost a lot of good men along the way. Is that where you hurt your leg?" "Among other places." His tone remained steady, matter of fact. "Took shrapnel at Chickamauga. Field surgeon did what he could, but some damage doesn't heal clean." Annie wanted to ask more, about the battles he'd seen, the friends he'd lost, the experiences that had left those careful lines around his eyes. But something in his manner suggested he'd shared what he was comfortable sharing, at least for now. Instead, she focused on the work at hand, letting the mountain silence speak for both of them. That afternoon brought their first trip to town together, a necessity driven by dwindling supplies and the need to check whether the trail was finally passable. Annie hitched Jasper to her small wagon while Matthew saddled his horse, and together they made the careful journey down the mountain path that had been carved into the steep hillside by countless trips over the years. Millfield sat in a natural valley where 3 mountain streams converged, a collection of weathered buildings that served the scattered ranches and mining claims in the area. It wasn't much to look at. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a small hotel, and a saloon that had seen better days. But it represented civilization and supplies for the people who called the mountains home. The moment they rode into town, Annie could feel the weight of curious stares. She was accustomed to being watched, to the whispered conversations that followed in her wake, but having Matthew beside her changed the dynamic in ways she hadn't anticipated. People looked at them together, speculating about the nature of their association, drawing conclusions from their comfortable proximity. "Let them look," Matthew said quietly, apparently noticing her discomfort. "Their opinions don't change who you are." At the general store, Mrs. Henderson, the woman whose son Annie had helped during the blizzard 2 winters past, greeted them with unexpected warmth. "Annie Colburn, as I live and breathe," she said, her face creasing into a genuine smile. "And you must be the gentleman who's been helping her through the storm," Sarah Hutchins mentioned seeing smoke from 2 chimneys up at your place. Annie felt her cheeks burn at the implication, but Matthew stepped smoothly into the conversation. Matthew Rigg, ma'am. Miss Colburn was kind enough to offer shelter when the weather turned bad. Fine hospitality in a hard season. Mrs. Henderson's. I sparkled with interest, but she was too polite to pry further. Instead, she helped them gather the supplies they needed, chatting about the storm damage and the early onset of winter weather. As they prepared to leave, she caught Annie's arm gently. "It's good to see you looking well," she said quietly. "And it's good to see you're not alone up there anymore." The ride back up the mountain was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the day's interactions. As they reached the homestead and began unloading supplies, Annie found herself wondering what the townspeople would say about Matthew's continued presence. More importantly, she found herself caring less about their opinions than she would have expected. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner by the fire, Annie caught herself imagining what it would be like if this arrangement continued indefinitely. The thought should have alarmed her. She'd spent years building a life that required no one else, protecting herself from the vulnerability that came with depending on another person. Instead, she found the possibility strangely comforting. "The trail will be clear enough for travel in another day or 2, Matthew said, as if reading her thoughts. "Yes," Annie agreed, though the word came out heavier than she'd intended. "I suppose it will." Neither of them mentioned what would happen then, whether Matthew would continue on to California as he'd originally planned, or if their growing partnership might evolve into something more permanent. But the question hung in the air between them, as delicate and significant as the pressed flowers that lay carefully preserved in their tissue paper wrappings, waiting for someone who would understand their true value. Winter settled over the mountains with a finality that made travel impossible and decisions unavoidable. The trail to town remained blocked by snow that showed no signs of melting, and Matthew's temporary stay stretched into something that felt increasingly permanent. Annie found herself grateful for the storm's lingering effects, though she was careful not to examine that gratitude too closely. Their days fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Matthew proved himself invaluable around the homestead, bringing not just an extra pair of hands, but a different perspective on problems Annie had been solving alone for years. He reinforced the chicken coop with a clever design that would keep predators out while allowing the birds easier access to their nesting boxes. He repaired her wagon with improvements that would make spring travel easier. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to make small changes to the cabin itself. Annie noticed them first as conveniences, a shelf positioned at exactly the right height for her to reach easily, hooks by the door placed to accommodate, both their coats, a wooden box crafted to hold kindling within easy reach of the fireplace. Each addition seemed to appear without fanfare, as if Matthew was unconsciously adapting their shared space to function better for 2 people rather than 1. "You don't have to keep improving my home," Annie said one evening, running her fingers over a beautifully carved wooden latch he'd installed on her pantry door. The old one had been broken for months, held shut with a piece of rope that had grown increasingly frayed. "Keeps my hands busy," Matthew replied, not looking up from the piece of wood he was shaping into what looked like it might become a candlestick. Besides, these things needed doing, might as well do them right. But Annie was beginning to understand that Matthew's improvements went beyond simple handyman work. Each addition was thoughtfully designed, crafted with care, that spoke of someone who expected to live with the results for a long time. Someone who was thinking beyond temporary convenience to long-term comfort and beauty. The realization should have alarmed her. She'd spent years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the vulnerability that came with letting someone become essential to her daily life. But watching Matthew work, seeing the quiet satisfaction he took in making their shared space more livable, she found those walls beginning to crumble. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing the last of the coffee from their trip to town, Annie retrieved her mother's quilt from the trunk where it had lain untouched for years. The quilt was unfinished, a complex star pattern in blues and yellows that her mother had been working on when fever took her. Annie had been only 12 at the time, too young to understand the intricate piecing techniques required to complete. Such ambitious work. I used to think I'd finish this someday, she said, spreading the partial quilt across her lap. But I never had the patience for needlework, and the pattern is too complex for someone with my limited skills. Matthew set down his carving and moved to examine the quilt more closely. His fingers traced the careful stitching, the precise points, where triangles of fabric came together to form the emerging star design. Your mother was a master needlewoman, he said with obvious appreciation. This is beautiful work. What made you think of it tonight? Annie wasn't sure how to answer that question honestly. She'd been thinking about families, about the domestic dreams her mother must have harbored when she started the quilt, about the life she'd planned to build with Annie's father, the children she'd hoped to cover with warm blankets during cold mountain nights. I suppose I've been wondering what she would think, Annie said finally, about all this, about you being here. What do you think she would think? Annie considered the question carefully. Her mother had been a gentle woman, someone who found joy in small domestic pleasures and took satisfaction in caring for the people she loved. She'd married Annie's father despite his reputation as a rough mountain man because she'd seen past his exterior to the decent heart beneath. I think she would have liked you, Annie said quietly. She believed people deserved to be judged by their actions, not their circumstances. Something in Matthew's expression shifted, softened. I would have been honored to know her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them contemplating the unfinished quilt that represented dreams interrupted by tragedy. Finally, Matthew spoke again. I could help you finish it if you'd like. I'm not skilled with a needle, but I could hold pieces while you work, help with the planning. The offer touched Annie more deeply than she'd expected. No one had ever volunteered to share in the completion of her mother's work, to help her honor that interrupted dream. The thought of working together on something so personal, so laden with memory and meaning, felt both terrifying and wonderful. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Over the following days, they developed a new evening routine. After dinner and the day's work were finished, they would spread the quilt pieces on the table and plan the next section of the pattern. Matthew proved surprisingly adept at understanding the geometric relationships that made the design work, and his steady hands were invaluable for holding fabric in place while Annie pieced delicate joints. Tell me about her, Matthew said one evening as Annie worked on a particularly challenging corner piece. Your mother, I mean. Annie found herself sharing memories she'd kept private for years. Her mother's laugh, the way she hummed while she worked, her gift for making the mountain cabin feel like a warm and welcoming home, despite its isolation. As she talked, her hands continued their careful stitching, and she began to understand why her mother had found such satisfaction in this work. There was something meditative about the repetitive motions, something peaceful about creating beauty, one small piece at a time. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Matthew said when Annie's stories wound down. She was. I've always wondered if I inherited any of her gifts. Annie looked up from her work to find Matthew watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I'm afraid I got more of my father's practical nature and less of her gentle grace. You have more of her in you than you think, Matthew said quietly. The way you care for wounded animals, the kindness you showed me when I was a stranger, that's grace, Annie. It just shows itself differently in you. The use of her given name, spoken with such gentle conviction, sent warmth spreading through Annie's chest. No one called her Annie anymore except in mockery. To everyone else she was Miss Colburn, or behind her back, Gravel Annie. But Matthew spoke her name like it was something precious, something worthy of respect and affection. That night, as she lay in her bed listening to Matthew's quiet breathing from the main room, Annie allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to hear her name spoken with such tenderness every day. The thought scared her with its intensity, but it also filled her with a longing she'd thought herself too practical to indulge. In the morning, she found a new addition to the cabin. A small wooden frame designed to hold work in progress, positioned perfectly to catch the best light from the window. Matthew had crafted it during the hours after she'd gone to sleep, creating a tool that would make their evening quilting sessions more comfortable and efficient. "For the quilt work," he said simply when she discovered it, as if creating beautiful, functional objects for her convenience was the most natural thing in the world. Annie ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the careful attention he'd paid to every joint and curve. Like everything Matthew made, it was both practical and beautiful, designed to last for years and crafted with a care that spoke of deep affection for its intended user. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate for the gift he'd given her. Not just the quilting frame, but the renewed connection to her mother's memory, the gentle encouragement that had helped her believe she might actually finish the work that had seemed impossible when attempted alone. As they settled into their evening routine with the new frame positioned to catch the lamplight, Annie realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer two people sharing space by necessity. They had become partners in something deeper, collaborators in the daily business of creating a life together. The recognition was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a precipice with no way to know what lay beyond the leap of faith required to move forward. The first real test of their growing partnership came on a bitter February morning when Matthew woke burning with fever and barely conscious. Annie found him trying to get up for morning chores, his face flushed and his movements unsteady. When she pressed her hand to his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin alarmed her. "You're not going anywhere today," she said firmly, helping him back to his bedroll by the fire. "Whatever this is, it needs tending." Matthew tried to protest, mumbling something about responsibilities and not being a burden, but his words were slurred with fever and exhaustion. Annie had seen enough sickness in her life to recognize when someone was truly ill rather than merely under the weather. This was the kind of fever that could turn dangerous if left untended. She spent the day nursing him through the worst of it, cooling his fevered skin with damp cloths and getting what fluids she could into him during his lucid moments. Matthew was a difficult patient, trying to get up and help with chores even when he could barely stand, apologizing repeatedly for the inconvenience his illness was causing. "Stop apologizing," Annie said, during one of his attempts to rise from his makeshift sickbed. "You think I'd turn out a sick man in weather like this? What kind of person do you take me for?" But as the fever peaked during the second night, Matthew's illness took a turn that revealed more about his past than months of careful conversation had done. In his delirium, he began to relive moments from the war, calling out warnings to long-dead comrades, describing battles in vivid detail, reliving the moment when shrapnel had torn through his leg and left him bleeding in the mud of some forgotten battlefield. Annie sat beside him through the long night, listening to fragments of stories that painted a picture of horror she could barely imagine. Matthew had seen things that would mark a man forever, had lost friends in ways that left scars deeper than any physical wound. When he cried out in his fever dreams, she took his hand and spoke quietly until he calmed, anchoring him to the present with the sound of her voice. "It's all right," she whispered during one particularly violent episode where he seemed to be trying to shield someone from attack. "You're safe now. The war is over." By the third day, the fever broke, leaving Matthew weak but coherent. When he woke to find Annie dozing in the chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his, something shifted in his expression, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that he quickly masked. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly, careful not to wake her, but Annie had already stirred at the sound of his voice. "Where else would I be?" she asked, checking his forehead for signs of returning fever. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," Matthew admitted, attempting a weak smile. But better, much better, thanks to you. Over the following days, as Matthew slowly regained his strength, their relationship settled into a new pattern of intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with trust. Annie had seen him at his most vulnerable, had heard the secrets his fever-loosened tongue had revealed, and she'd responded with simple care rather than judgment or pity. Matthew, in turn, had experienced what it meant to be tended by someone who asked nothing in return except the privilege of helping. "I owe you an explanation," Matthew said one evening as they sat by the fire, his color finally returning to normal. "About the things I said when I was out of my head." "You don't owe me anything," Annie replied, focusing on her quilting to give him privacy if he chose not to continue. "Maybe not," Matthew said, "but I'd like to tell you anyway, some of it at least." He spoke haltingly at first, then with growing steadiness, about the battles he'd seen and the friends he'd lost, about the guilt that followed him like a shadow, the conviction that he should have done more, saved more, been braver when it mattered most, about the way the war had ended for him, not in glory or even relief, but in a field hospital tent where a doctor with too little time and too many patients had done what he could to save Matthew's leg and sent him back into a world that had no use for broken soldiers. "I've been drifting ever since," he admitted. "Couldn't settle anywhere, couldn't see the point in putting down roots when everything good seemed to get torn away eventually." Annie set down her needlework and looked at him directly. "And now?" Matthew was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if he might find answers in the dancing flames. "Now, I'm beginning to think maybe I was looking for the wrong kind of good. Maybe what matters isn't whether things last forever, but whether they matter while they're happening." The conversation left them both thoughtful, and Annie found herself considering how much her own perspective had changed since Matthew's arrival. She'd built her life around the assumption that solitude was safer than connection, that independence was more reliable than partnership. But watching Matthew fight his way back from illness, seeing his gratitude for simple care freely given, she began to understand that isolation might protect her from loss, but it also protected her from everything that made loss meaningful. A week later, their growing closeness faced a different kind of test when they made another necessary trip to town for supplies. This time, the reaction from the townspeople was markedly different. Word had spread about Matthew's extended stay at Annie's homestead, and the speculation had grown more pointed in their absence. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson's greeting was cooler than before, tinged with a disapproval that made Annie's cheeks burn. The other customers made no effort to hide their stares or lower their voices when discussing the impropriety of a single woman housing a man without benefit of marriage. "Scandalous, if you ask me," Annie heard Mrs. Campbell whisper to her companion. "Living up there alone with that drifter like their man and wife. No decent woman would put herself in such a position." Annie felt the familiar weight of judgment settle over her shoulders. The old shame that came from being found wanting by community standards she'd never been able to meet. But this time, something was different. This time, she had someone standing beside her who'd seen her true worth, who'd chosen to stay not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he wanted to be there. Matthew seemed to sense her discomfort, moving slightly closer as they gathered their supplies. His presence was quietly protective without being possessive, a reminder that she wasn't facing the disapproval alone. "Let them talk," he said quietly as they loaded their purchases into the wagon. "Their narrow minds can't diminish what we've built together." But the encounter had planted seeds of doubt that grew as they made the journey back up the mountain. Annie found herself wondering if Matthew's presence in her life was worth the social cost, whether she had the right to expose him to the kind of gossip that would follow him if he stayed. She'd learned to live with being an outsider, but he still had choices. He could still leave, find a place where his past was unknown and his future uncomplicated by association with the mountain woman who defied conventional expectations. That Evening, as they worked together on the quilt that was nearing completion, Annie finally voiced her concerns. "You know they'll never stop talking," she said without looking up from her stitching. "About us, I mean. About what people think we're doing up here." Matthew's hand stilled on the fabric he was holding in place for her. "Does that matter to you?" "It matters that it might matter to you," Annie replied honestly. "You don't have to tie yourself to someone the whole town considers a scandal. You still have time to move on, start fresh somewhere else." When Matthew didn't respond immediately, Annie felt her heart sink. She'd given him permission to leave, and perhaps he was realizing that was exactly what he wanted to do. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that surprised her. "Annie, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing something in his expression that made her breath catch. "I've spent 15 years running from everything that mattered, telling myself I was protecting other people from my damaged goods," he said quietly. "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of letting other people's opinions decide what I deserve. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be." The simple declaration hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Annie felt the last of her carefully. Constructed defenses crumble, leaving her heart exposed and vulnerable and terrifyingly full of hope. "I'd like that too," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Outside, the mountain wind howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, but inside, two people who'd spent years believing themselves unworthy of love had finally found the courage to reach for something better. The quilt spread between them glowed in the lamplight, nearly finished now, its star pattern emerging as clearly as the future they were beginning to imagine together. The morning that would change everything began with Annie and Matthew working side by side to repair the fence line that bordered the eastern edge of her property. It was the kind of peaceful domestic task that had become second nature to them over the months of their partnership, their movements synchronized by countless hours of shared labor. Matthew was securing a new fence post when his shovel struck something that rang with a metallic sound against the iron blade. He paused, frowning, then began carefully digging around the obstruction. What emerged was a metal strongbox, its surface green with age but still intact, buried perhaps 2 feet beneath the surface. "What in the world?" Annie began, then stopped, as she recognized the box. "That's my father's. I remember him carrying it when we first came to the mountain, but I thought it was lost in the move." Together, they carried the heavy box back to the cabin, where Annie retrieved the key ring her father had left her. The third key fit perfectly, and the lid opened with a rusty creak to reveal contents that made them both catch their breath. Inside were stacks of official documents, some papers yellowed with age, and at the very bottom a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. But it was the documents that drew Annie's attention first. Territorial filing papers, survey maps, and what appeared to be mineral rights claims dating back to 1863. "Look at this," Annie said, unfolding one of the maps with trembling hands. "This shows our property, but it extends much further than I thought. And these marks here," she pointed to notations in her father's careful handwriting, "they're labeled silver deposit confirmed and high-grade ore samples." Matthew leaned closer, studying the documents with growing amazement. "Your father was a prospector before he was a rancher?" Annie shook her head slowly, pieces of her childhood memories suddenly falling into place. "Not exactly, but I remember him disappearing for days at a time when I was young, coming back with rocks he'd study by lamplight. He always said he was securing our future, but I thought he meant the farming." She found another document that made her gasp, a territorial mineral rights claim filed in her father's name, covering not just their homestead but nearly 800 acres of the surrounding mountains. According to the papers, he'd discovered significant silver deposits throughout the region, but had chosen never to develop them. The leather pouch contained gold and silver coins totaling nearly $300. More money than Annie had seen in her entire adult life. But tucked beneath the coins was a letter in her father's handwriting, addressed simply to "My daughter Annie." With hands that weren't entirely steady, Annie unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "My dearest Annie, if you are reading this, then you have found what I hoped would remain buried until you truly needed it. The mineral rights in this box represent a fortune in silver, enough to make you wealthy beyond your current dreams. But wealth comes with choices, and some choices change who we are in ways we cannot undo. I discovered these deposits early in our time on the mountain, but I chose to leave them untouched. I wanted to give you a childhood of simple pleasures, rather than the complications that come with sudden wealth. I wanted you to know your own strength, to understand your own worth, before the world tried to tell you that money was the measure of a person's value. The claims are yours now, to develop, or leave dormant as you see fit. But remember that the mountain gave us everything we needed without digging up her secrets. Sometimes the greatest treasure is knowing when you have enough. Your loving father, Samuel Colburn." Annie's voice broke on the final words, and she sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd discovered. According to the survey maps and assay reports, her father had found deposits that could yield tens of thousands of dollars in extracted silver. Matthew had gone very quiet beside her, and when Annie looked up, she saw something in his expression that made her heart sink. The easy warmth that had characterized their relationship was being replaced by something more complicated, more uncertain. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "Does it?" Annie asked, though she could see in his face that it already had. Matthew rose from his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the mountains as if seeing them for the first time. "A few hours ago, I was a drifter who'd found honest work with a good woman. Now," he gestured helplessly at the documents spread across the table, "now I'm a man who's been courting an heiress without knowing it." "You weren't courting anything," Annie protested. "You were building a life with someone who cared about you." "Was I?" Matthew's voice carried a pain that cut through her like a knife. "How can I ever be sure now? How can you be sure? Maybe I sensed something about your circumstances. Maybe I unconsciously knew there was more here than met the eye." Annie felt anger rise in her chest, protective and fierce. "That's nonsense, Matthew, and you know it. My father buried this box before you ever set foot on this mountain. There was nothing for you to sense except what we built together through honest work and honest feeling. But everything's different now," Matthew said, turning back to face her. "You have choices, Annie, real choices. You could develop those claims, take that money to Denver or San Francisco, marry a banker or a doctor, someone who could give you the kind of life you deserve." "And what kind of life do I deserve?" Annie demanded, rising from her own chair. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Better than a broken-down soldier with nothing to offer but a willingness to work hard and a heart that's already yours." The simple declaration stopped Annie's anger cold, replacing it with something deeper and more urgent. In all their careful conversations, all their growing intimacy, neither of them had spoken so directly about their feelings. Now, in the midst of this crisis, Matthew had laid his heart bare with the desperate honesty of a man who believed he was about to lose everything that mattered. "Matthew," she said, moving to stand in front of him, "look at me." When he raised his eyes to meet hers, she saw the full depth of his struggle reflected there, love and fear, and the terrible certainty that he was somehow unworthy of the good fortune that had entered his life. "Do you really think so little of me that you believe I'd throw away something real for the promise of something more profitable?" she asked. "I think you're a woman who's spent her whole life accepting less than she deserved," Matthew replied, reaching up to touch her cheek with infinite gentleness. "And I think this discovery gives you the chance to have more. You'd be a fool not to take it." "Then I'm a fool," Annie said firmly, "because I know exactly what I want, and it's not buried in the ground." She turned back to the table, where her father's documents lay spread like a map of possibilities, then deliberately began gathering them into a neat stack. My father was right about choices, Matthew, and I choose to leave the silver where it is. Matthew stared at her in shock. Annie, you could be walking away from a fortune. I could be walking away from a life I don't want, she interrupted. This mountain, this cabin, the partnership we've built together, that's worth more to me than all the silver in Colorado Territory. She moved to the fireplace and knelt beside it, the documents still in her hands. My father gave me a choice, and I'm making it. These claims can stay buried with his secrets. Wait, Matthew said urgently, moving to stop her. Don't destroy them. Just let's talk about this. Annie paused, the papers still in her hands. What's to talk about? I know what I want, Matthew. The question is whether you can believe that what I want is you. Matthew knelt beside her on the hearth, his hands covering hers on the documents. I love you, Annie Colburn, he said simply. I've loved you since the night we saved Charlie together, maybe since the first moment I saw you standing on that porch like you owned the whole world. And if you'll have me, if you can forgive my doubts, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving that money never had anything to do with it. Annie felt tears of relief and joy spill down her cheeks as she set the documents aside and reached for him. I love you too, Matthew, and there's nothing to forgive except your own stubborn refusal to believe you deserve happiness. They held each other there beside the fireplace, surrounded by the evidence of wealth they'd chosen to ignore in favor of something more valuable. Later, they would secure the documents in the strongbox and bury it again, this time together, sealing away temptation in favor of the simple riches they'd already found. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines like a benediction, and the fence they'd been mending stood straight and strong, a fitting metaphor for the love that had been tested and emerged even stronger than before. Some treasures, they'd learned, were worth more when left undisturbed, and some choices required more courage than any amount of money could buy. The week that followed their mutual declaration of love should have been the happiest of Annie's life, but the shadow of James Hartwell's return hung over everything like an approaching storm. She and Matthew went about their daily routines with a new tenderness between them, but both were acutely aware that their decision to refuse the mining offer would bring consequences they couldn't fully predict. We need to be prepared for him. To argue, Matthew said one morning, as they repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by spring runoff. Men like Hartwell don't give up easily when there's that much money involved. Annie nodded, testing the tension on a wire they'd just strung. I've been thinking about that. He seemed awfully confident that I'd accept his terms, like he couldn't imagine anyone turning down such an opportunity. Maybe he's never dealt with someone who values other things more than money, Matthew suggested. But as the days passed, Annie began to realize that Hartwell's confidence might be based on more than simple arrogance. Word of her newfound wealth had somehow spread through Millfield despite her not telling anyone, and the reactions from townspeople during their next supply run made it clear that public opinion was firmly against her right to refuse such a generous offer. $50,000, Mrs. Henderson said, her tone carrying a disapproval that stung more than Annie had expected. And you're considering turning it down. Annie Colburn, I always thought you had more sense than that. At the general store, conversation stopped when she entered, only to resume in whispers that weren't quite quiet enough to miss entirely. The consensus seemed to be that Annie was being ungrateful, foolish, or possibly both. Some went further, suggesting that her refusal to develop the mineral rights was selfish, depriving the community of the jobs and prosperity that a successful mining operation would bring. It's not their decision to make, Matthew said quietly as they loaded their supplies, aware of the hostile stares following their every movement. But Annie could see the strain in his face, the way his jaw tightened when he overheard the more pointed comments about her fitness to make such momentous decisions. The worst of it came from Jake Morrison, a rancher whose spread bordered her property and who'd never missed an opportunity to make clear his opinion of women who lived outside conventional boundaries. Of course, some folks might wonder if she's really making this choice on her own, Morrison said to his companion, his voice pitched to carry. Man shows up out of nowhere, spends the winter warming her bed, and suddenly she don't want the money that might make her independent of his influence. Matthew went very still beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip before he caught himself. Annie had seen him angry before, but never like this, controlled fury that made him more dangerous rather than less. "Let it go," she said quietly, touching his arm. "He's trying to provoke a reaction." "He's questioning your honor," Matthew replied, his voice low and deadly calm. "And mine." "He's questioning my judgment," Annie corrected. "And he has the right to do that, even if he's wrong. Fighting him won't change anyone's mind about anything." But the encounter left them both shaken, and Annie began to understand that their decision to refuse the mining offer would cost them more than just money. It would cost them whatever fragile acceptance she'd begun to earn in the community, and it would expose Matthew to the kind of suspicion and hostility that could make his life impossible. That evening, as they sat by the fire working on the final details of her mother's quilt, Annie brought up the concern that had been growing in her mind all day. "You know this is only going to get worse," she said, focusing on her stitching to avoid meeting his eyes. "The talk, the suspicion. If you stay with me after I refuse Hartwell's offer, people will always wonder about your motives." Matthew's hand stilled on the fabric he was holding. "Are you asking me to leave?" "I'm saying I'd understand if you wanted to," Annie replied, though the words felt like glass in her throat. "You could go to California like you originally planned. Start fresh somewhere no one knows about any of this. Is that what you want?" Annie finally looked up, meeting his gaze across the nearly completed quilt. "No, but what I want and what's fair to you might be different things." Matthew set down the fabric and reached across the space between them to take her hands. "Annie, I spent 15 years running from difficult situations, telling myself I was protecting other people from my problems. I'm not going to start running again now, especially not from the best thing that's ever happened to me, even if it means dealing with years of gossip and suspicion, even if it means dealing with whatever comes," Matthew said firmly. "We'll face it together." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Sarah Hutchins, the schoolteacher from Millfield. Sarah was one of the few unmarried women in town, a spinster by choice who dedicated her life to education and had always treated Annie with quiet respect rather than pity or scorn. "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced," Sarah said, as Annie invited her inside for coffee, "but I wanted to speak with you before Mr. Hartwell returns." Annie exchanged glances with Matthew, who'd been splitting wood nearby and had come in when he saw their visitor. Sarah's manner was serious, almost urgent, in a way that suggested her visit was more than a social call. "What about Mr. Hartwell?" Annie asked. Sarah accepted the cup of coffee Annie offered, then looked between them with an expression of concern. "I've been doing some research, asking questions through contacts I have in Denver. James Hartwell represents the Consolidated Mountain Mining Company, as he claimed, but there are some things about that company that I think you should know." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded newspaper clipping. Consolidated Mountain has been involved in several disputes over mineral rights in the past 5 years. In each case, they've approached property owners with similar offers to the one they made you, and in each case, the original owners have ended up with far less than they were promised. Annie took the clipping, scanning the article with growing alarm. It detailed a lawsuit in which a family had lost their ancestral land after partnering with Consolidated Mountain, claiming that the company had manipulated expenses and extraction reports to minimize the owner's share of profits. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I spoke with a lawyer friend in Denver who's familiar with the company. He said their standard practice is to make partnerships seem generous while maintaining control over all actual operations. Once they've established mining operations on a property, they have ways of making continued partnership difficult for the original owners. Matthew leaned forward, his expression grim. What kind of ways? Legal challenges to the validity of claims, sudden discovery of environmental complications that require expensive remediation, disputes over property boundaries that tie up profits in court for years, Sarah explained. Their goal isn't partnership, it's acquisition. They want your land, Annie, and they're prepared to use whatever methods necessary to get it. Annie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Sarah's information was accurate, then Hartwell's offer wasn't the generous opportunity he'd presented it as, but rather the first step in a complex scheme to separate her from her property entirely. "Why are you telling me this?" Annie asked. Sarah's smile was sad but determined. "Because I've watched you build a life on your own terms for years, and I admire the strength that took, because you've helped people in this community without expecting anything in return, and because I think you deserve to make your decision based on the truth, rather than lies dressed up as opportunity." After Sarah left, Annie and Matthew sat in troubled silence, both of them grappling with the implications of what they'd learned. The decision to refuse Hartwell's offer had seemed difficult, but straightforward when it was simply about choosing love over money. Now it appeared to be about something more fundamental, protecting everything they'd built from people who would destroy it for profit. "What do you think he'll do when you refuse?" Matthew asked. "I don't know," Annie admitted, "but I have a feeling we're about to find out." That afternoon, as if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses announced Hartwell's return. This time he was accompanied by 4 men, rather than 2, and their manner as they rode into the yard was markedly different from his previous visit. Where before he'd been all smiles and false friendliness, now there was something harder in his demeanor, something that suggested he'd come prepared for resistance. "Miss Colburn," he said as he dismounted, not bothering with pleasantries, "I trust you've had time to consider my offer." Annie stepped out onto her porch, Matthew beside her, both of them presenting a united front. "I have, Mr. Hartwell, and I'm afraid I must decline." Hartwell's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that confirmed Sarah's warnings about his true nature. "I see. May I ask why you would refuse such a generous proposition?" "Because it's my land, and I prefer to keep it." "As it is," Annie replied simply. "Your land," Hartwell repeated, pulling a set of documents from his coat. "About that, Miss Colburn, it seems there may be some irregularities in your father's original claim. Questions about whether proper procedures were followed, whether all necessary fees were paid." Annie felt Matthew tense beside her, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that might invalidate the entire claim," Hartwell said with false regret. "Of course, Consolidated Mountain would be happy to help resolve these issues for a reasonable fee. Or we could simply purchase the property outright, saving you the expense and uncertainty of a legal challenge." The threat was clear, wrapped in legal language, but unmistakable in its intent. Hartwell was prepared to use whatever means necessary to force her cooperation up to and including challenging her right to own the land her father had left her. "And if I refuse that offer as well?" Annie asked. Hartwell's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then I'm afraid you'll find yourself facing some very expensive legal proceedings, Miss Colburn. Proceedings that could drag on for years and cost far more than you could afford to fight." Annie looked at the men who'd accompanied Hartwell, noting their hard faces and the careful way they positioned themselves around the yard. This wasn't just a business negotiation anymore. It was intimidation, pure and simple. But as she stood there facing down these men who thought they could frighten her into surrendering what was rightfully hers, Annie felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. This was her home, the place where she'd found love and built a life worth living. She'd be damned if she'd let anyone take it from her without a fight. "Then I suppose we'll see each other in court, Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "Because this mountain isn't for sale." Hartwell's expression darkened, and for a moment Annie thought he might drop the pretense of legal respectability entirely. But then he seemed to remember where he was and who might be watching, and his lawyer's mask slipped back into place. "You're making a mistake, Miss Colburn," he said as he remounted his horse. "A very costly mistake. I do hope you'll reconsider before it's too late." As the group rode away, Annie and Matthew stood together in the sudden quiet, both of them understanding that the battle for their future had only just begun. But they also understood something else, that whatever came next, they would face it together with love as their foundation and courage as their weapon. The war might be far from over, but the first battle lines had been drawn, and Annie Colburn was ready to fight for everything that mattered. 3 days after Hartwell's threatening visit, Matthew disappeared before dawn, without explanation, leaving only a brief note that said he'd return by evening and asking Annie not to worry. But worry she did, pacing the cabin floor and starting at every sound from outside, her mind conjuring scenarios of legal papers being served or worse. When he finally returned, as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, Matthew looked like a man who'd ridden hard and carried the weight of important decisions. His clothes were dusty from travel, and there was something in his expression that spoke of resolution reached after considerable struggle. "Where did you go?" Annie asked, relief and exasperation warring in her voice. "Denver," Matthew replied, dismounting from his weary horse. "I needed to speak with someone, and it couldn't wait." "Denver? That's a 2-day ride each way." "I know," Matthew interrupted gently, "but some things are worth the effort." He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a thick envelope, its contents bulging with what appeared to be official documents. "I went to see a lawyer, Annie. A real one, not someone working for mining companies. I wanted to know exactly where we stand legally and what options we have for fighting Hartwell's threats." Annie felt her heart clench with gratitude and something deeper, the recognition that Matthew had spent his own money and risked his own safety to protect what they'd built together. "What did you learn?" "That Hartwell is bluffing mostly," Matthew said, his voice carrying grim satisfaction. "Your father's claim is solid, filed properly and maintained according to territorial law. Consolidated Mountain would have a hard time challenging it successfully, though they could certainly make the process expensive and time-consuming." "And the mineral rights?" "Yours, absolutely. The lawyer, his name is Thomas Bradley. And Sarah. Hutchins recommended him. Says you have every right to refuse to develop them, refuse to partner with anyone, or refuse to sell outright. No one can force you to allow mining on your own property." Annie felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "So, we can fight them?" "We can," Matthew agreed. "Bradley is willing to represent you if it comes to that, and he's confident about winning any legal challenge Hartwell might mount. But there's something else, Annie, something I need to discuss with you." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely, noting the nervous energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath his calm exterior. "What is it?" Matthew took a deep breath, then reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper covered with his careful handwriting. "I wrote something while I was in Denver, something I've been trying to find the courage to say for weeks now." He handed her the letter, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched hers. "Read this, please, and know that I wrote it before I spoke to the lawyer, before I knew anything about our legal position. What I'm about to ask you has nothing to do with money or property or anything except what's in my heart." Annie unfolded the letter with hands that weren't entirely steady, immediately recognizing the care that had gone into every word. "My dearest Annie, I have never been a man of eloquent words, but love has a way of making cowards brave and silence unbearable. I can no longer go another day without telling you the truth that lives in my heart. Before I met you, I was a man without direction, carrying my wounds like badges of honor and my loneliness like a shield against further hurt. I had convinced myself that some people are meant to walk through life alone, that my damaged past made me unworthy of the kind of happiness I saw in other men's lives. You changed everything. Not because you needed saving, you are the strongest person I have ever known, but because you saw something in me worth saving. You took a broken soldier and showed him what it meant to have a home, a purpose, a reason to believe in tomorrow. These months we have shared have been the best of my life. Working beside you, learning your ways, building something together from nothing but hope and determination. These simple pleasures have given my existence meaning I never thought possible. Love your strength and your gentleness, your wisdom and your fierce independence. I love the way you tend wounded creatures, the way you speak to the mountains like old friends, the way you make ordinary moments feel sacred. I love your laugh when you think no one is listening, and I love your tears when you think no one is watching. I know I have little to offer beyond a willing heart and hands that will never stop working for your happiness. I know there are men with more money, better prospects, unmarked by war, and the mistakes that brought me to your door. But I also know that no one could ever love you more completely than I do, or fight harder to be worthy of the gift you represent. Annie Colburn, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that love can be stronger than doubt, that two broken people can make each other whole? If your answer is yes, you will make me the happiest man in Colorado Territory. If it is no, I will understand and be grateful for the time you have given me. With all my love and devotion, Matthew. Annie read the letter twice, tears blurring her vision as the full impact of his words settled in her heart. When she finally looked up, she found Matthew watching her with an expression of hope and terror that broke her heart and mended it in the same moment. You wrote this in Denver, she whispered. Yesterday morning, sitting in a hotel room and trying to find the courage to come home and say it out loud, Matthew replied. I've been carrying it around like a loaded gun, afraid to fire but unable to put it away. Annie folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest like something precious. Matthew Rigg, are you asking me to marry you? I am, he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I know it's not the romantic proposal you deserve, and I know the timing is complicated with everything that's happening with Hartwell. But I couldn't wait any longer to tell you how I feel. And what if I say yes? Annie asked, though her heart was already singing with the answer. What if I want to marry a man with nothing to offer but love? Matthew's face lit up with a joy so pure it took her breath away. Then I'd say you're getting the better end of the bargain, and I'd spend every day trying to prove myself worthy of your faith. Annie stepped closer, reaching up to frame his face with her hands. Then yes, Matthew Rigg, yes, I'll marry you, today, tomorrow, whenever you want, because there's nothing I want more than to spend my life with you. The kiss that followed was tender and fierce, full of promises and hope, and the sweet relief of love finally acknowledged and accepted. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd just committed to each other. There's one more thing, Matthew said, reaching into his coat again. This time he produced a small wooden box, carved with the same careful attention to detail he brought to everything he made. It's not much, but Annie opened the box to find a simple gold band, clearly old but polished to a warm glow. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and she could see the care that had gone into selecting it. It belonged to my mother, Matthew said quietly. The only thing of value I saved from the war. I had it cleaned in Denver, and the jeweler said it would fit you properly. If you don't like it, we can find something else. It's perfect, Annie interrupted, extending her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, settling into place with the rightness of something meant to be. Absolutely perfect. They stood together in the gathering dusk, newly engaged and facing an uncertain future, but united in their determination to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. The mountain wind whispered around them like a blessing, and for the first time. Since Hartwell's arrival, Annie felt genuinely hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. They had love, they had each other, and they had the law on their side. Whatever Consolidated Mountain Mining Company thought they could take by force or intimidation, they were about to learn that some things were worth fighting for, and some people would never surrender what mattered most. The final confrontation came exactly 1 week after Matthew's proposal on a crisp May morning when the mountain air carried the promise of summer and new beginnings. Annie was feeding the chickens when she spotted the dust cloud that announced multiple riders approaching her homestead. This time, Hartwell had brought nearly a dozen men, their presence clearly intended to intimidate rather than negotiate. Matthew emerged from the barn where he'd been tending to the animals, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that spoke of old military habits and current wariness. Together, they watched as the party crested the final rise and rode into their yard with the confident aggression of men who believed they held all the advantages. "Miss Colburn," Hartwell called as he dismounted, his voice carrying false pleasantry that fooled no one. "I trust you've had time to reconsider my generous offer." "I told you my answer a week ago, Mr. Hartwell," Annie replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "It hasn't changed." Hartwell's smile turned sharp, predatory. "I'm afraid circumstances have changed, however. You see, we've discovered some irregularities in your property boundaries that require immediate attention. It seems your father may have been mistaken about exactly where his claim ended and public land began." He gestured to one of his men, who produced a surveyor's transit and began setting it up with theatrical precision. "We're here to conduct an official survey, which I'm sure will resolve any confusion about mineral rights in the disputed areas." Annie felt Matthew tense beside her, but she kept her own voice level. "You have no authority to survey my property without a court order, Mr. Hartwell." "Actually, I do," Hartwell replied, producing yet another set of official-looking documents. "Territorial statute allows for boundary surveys when mineral rights are in dispute. I'm sure you understand the importance of clarity in such matters." But before Annie could respond, a new voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "I'm afraid you're mistaken about your authority, Mr. Hartwell." Everyone turned to see Thomas Bradley, the lawyer Matthew had consulted in Denver, riding up the trail with two companions Annie didn't recognize. Bradley was a small, neat man with silver hair and eyes like steel, and his presence immediately shifted the balance of power in the yard. "Mr. Bradley," Hartwell said, his confidence faltering slightly, "what brings you to these remote mountains?" "My client, Miss Colburn, naturally," Bradley replied, dismounting with the careful dignity of a man accustomed to being taken seriously. "I'm here to inform you that any attempt to survey her property without proper legal authorization will be met with immediate legal action." Hartwell's face flushed red, but he maintained his lawyer's composure. "The territorial statute clearly states, the territorial statute requires a formal complaint filed with the land office and a hearing before any disputed survey can be authorized," Bradley interrupted, "neither of which has occurred in this case. What you're proposing is trespassing, pure and simple." One of Bradley's companions stepped forward, and Annie recognized him from Matthew's description as James Morrison, a territorial marshal with jurisdiction over land disputes. The star on his chest gleamed in the morning sunlight, and his presence made several of Hartwell's men shift nervously. "Mr. Hartwell," Morrison said in the flat tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I suggest you pack up your equipment and leave this property immediately. Miss Colburn has made her position clear, and you have no legal standing to be here." "This is a private business matter," Hartwell began. "This is attempted claim jumping dressed up in legal language," Morrison replied, "and if you're not off this mountain in the next 10 minutes, you'll be explaining your business to a territorial judge." The standoff stretched for several tense moments, with Hartwell clearly weighing his options against the very real threat of legal consequences. Finally, with obvious reluctance, He gestured to his men to pack up their equipment. "This isn't over. Miss Colburn," he said, remounting his horse. "Consolidated Mountain has significant resources and considerable patience. We'll find another way to resolve this matter." "No, Mr. Hartwell," Annie replied, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "It is over. My answer is final. My property is protected by law, and I have excellent legal representation. Find another mountain to plunder." As Hartwell and his men rode away in defeat, Annie felt a mixture of relief and triumph that left her slightly breathless. She'd stood up to intimidation, protected what was hers, and emerged victorious. But more than that, she'd discovered reserves of strength and courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Well done," Bradley said, approaching with obvious approval. "You handled that exactly right. Firm, but not provocative. Clear, but not antagonistic." "Thank you for coming," Annie replied. "All of you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did. Matthew sent word through some mutual contacts," Bradley explained. "We've been keeping an eye on Consolidated Mountain's activities, and this fits their usual pattern. They rely on intimidation because their legal position is usually weak." Marshal Morrison tipped his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, I want you to know that any further harassment from Hartwell or his company should be reported immediately. What they attempted today was illegal, and we take such matters seriously." After the officials departed, promising to file formal complaints against Consolidated Mountain, Annie and Matthew found themselves alone in the sudden quiet of their yard. The confrontation that had loomed over them for weeks was finally over. Decided not through violence or surrender, but through the simple application of law and justice. "It's really finished?" Annie asked, still hardly daring to believe it. "It's finished," Matthew confirmed, pulling her into his arms. "Hartwell won't be back." Bradley made it clear that any further interference would result in federal charges, and even mining companies don't want that kind of attention. Annie leaned into his embrace, feeling the last of her tension drain away. They had won, not just the legal battle, but something more important, the right to live their lives on their own terms, free from the interference of those who would exploit them for profit. "There's something else," Matthew said, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. "While Bradley was here, I asked him about marriage licenses, about what we'd need to do to make this official." Annie pulled back to look at him, noting the hopeful expression on his face. "And what did he say?" "He said we could be married right here, as soon as we're ready. Marshal Morrison is authorized to perform ceremonies, and Bradley can serve as a witness. We don't have to wait, don't have to travel to Denver, or deal with any more complications." The possibility of immediate marriage sent a thrill through Annie's chest. After everything they'd faced, the idea of claiming their happiness without further delay held enormous appeal. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, though her heart was already racing with anticipation. "I'm suggesting we get married today," Matthew said, his eyes bright with love and determination. "Right here on our mountain, surrounded by everything we've built together. What do you say, Annie Colburn? Are you ready to become Mrs. Matthew Rigg?" Annie looked around at the homestead they'd improved together, the cabin where they'd found love, the mountains that had sheltered their growing partnership. This was where they belonged, where their story had begun, and where it should continue. "Yes," she said, her voice strong with certainty. "Yes, I'm ready." The simple ceremony that followed was perfect in its lack of pretension. Annie wore her best dress, the blue one her father had bought her for church services she rarely attended, and Matthew had somehow managed to shave and put on clean clothes despite the morning's excitement. Marshal Morrison spoke the traditional words with dignity and warmth, while Bradley served as witness, and the mountains themselves seemed to bless their union. When Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender and full of promise, witnessed by the endless sky and the ancient peaks that had brought them together. As they broke apart, both of them laughing and crying at the same time, Annie caught sight of her mother's wedding ring glinting on her finger, the ring she'd kept in a tin box for years, believing she'd never have occasion to wear it. "Mrs. Rigg," Matthew said softly, testing the sound of her new name. I like the sound of that, Annie replied, reaching up to touch his face with wonder. Though I think I might keep Colburn for business purposes, Annie Colburn Rigg has a nice sound to it. Don't you think? I think anything you want to call yourself is fine by me, Matthew said, pulling her close again. As long as you're mine. As the afternoon wore on, and their few guests prepared to depart, Annie found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than a year ago, she'd been resigned to spending her life alone, convinced that love was for other people. Now she was married to a man who saw her true worth, who'd chosen her not despite her rough edges, but because of the strength they represented. No regrets? Matthew asked as they stood together, watching the last of the officials disappear down the mountain trail. Annie considered the question seriously, thinking about the $50,000 she'd turned down, the comfortable life she could have had in Denver, the respectability that money might have bought her. Then she looked at her husband, and felt only gratitude for the choices that had led them here. None, she said firmly, not a single one. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Rigg walked hand in hand toward their cabin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to build the life they'd chosen together. But tonight was for celebration, for the quiet happiness of two people who'd found in each other everything they'd ever needed. The mountain wind whispered around them like a blessing, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of summer. And if the ancient peaks had voices, they might have spoken of patience rewarded, of love discovered in the most unlikely places, and of two hearts finally finding their way home to each other. 1 year later, Annie Colburn Rigg stood in the doorway of the cabin that had become their home, watching her husband lay the foundation stones for the addition they'd been planning since spring. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, more pronounced now, but no less handsome for its increased presence, and highlighted the contentment that had settled into the lines of his face like permanent sunshine. The past year had brought changes both subtle and profound. The cabin itself had grown to accommodate their expanding life together, with a proper bedroom, a workshop for Matthew's woodworking, and a larger kitchen where Annie could pursue the bread baking that had become unexpectedly popular with their neighbors. The hostile whispers that had once followed them through Millfield had gradually given way to respectful acknowledgement of their partnership, helped along by Matthew's quiet competence and Annie's continued willingness to help community members. In times of need, the marshal was right about Hartwell, Matthew called, straightening from his work to wipe sweat from his forehead. Haven't heard so much as a whisper from Consolidated Mountain since the territorial government started investigating their business practices. Annie smiled, remembering the newspaper article Thomas Bradley had sent them last month, detailing the federal charges filed against the mining company for illegal claim, jumping in 3 different territories. Justice had indeed been served. Though she felt no particular satisfaction in Hartwell's downfall, she was too busy building her own happiness to waste energy on past adversaries. Sarah says they're looking for a new schoolteacher in Millfield, Annie said, settling onto the porch steps with a cup of coffee and the letter that had arrived with yesterday's mail delivery. Someone to assist with the older children while she focuses on the younger ones. Matthew paused in his work, understanding immediately where her thoughts were heading. You're thinking of applying? I'm thinking about it, Annie admitted. I have the education for it, and I think I might enjoy working with children. Besides, it would give us a more regular income to supplement what we make from the homestead. It was a conversation they'd been having more frequently as their first wedding anniversary approached, discussions about the future, about expansion, about the practical considerations of building a life that would sustain them through whatever years lay ahead. They'd learned to plan together, to share dreams and concerns with the easy intimacy of true partners. You know, I'll support whatever decision you make, Matthew said, resuming his careful placement of stones. "Though I have to say, the idea of my wife being the schoolteacher has a certain appeal. Gives a man a sense of pride, being married to someone the whole community respects." Annie felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Respect was something she'd never expected to earn in Millfield, but somehow, over the course of their marriage, it had materialized. Perhaps it was Matthew's presence that had changed how people saw her, or perhaps it was her own increased confidence that had shifted their perceptions. Either way, she no longer felt like an outsider in her own community. "There's something else," she said, setting down her coffee cup and moving to sit on the foundation stones beside where Matthew worked. "Something I've been wanting to discuss with you." Something in her tone made him look up sharply, his hands stilling on the rock he'd been positioning. "What is it?" Annie took a deep breath, gathering her courage for a conversation she'd been anticipating with equal parts excitement and nervousness. "I've been thinking about children, Matthew, about whether we want to try for a family of our own." The question had been growing in importance as their marriage settled into comfortable routine. At 33, Annie knew her time for bearing. Children was limited, but the desire had strengthened rather than diminished over their year together. Watching Matthew interact with the few children who visited their homestead, seeing his gentle patience and natural teaching ability, had convinced her that he would make an excellent father. Matthew set down his tools entirely, giving her his full attention. "What do you want, Annie? Not what you think I want or what you think we should want, but what your heart tells you." "I want children with you," she said simply. "I want to watch you teach a son to work with his hands the way you've taught me. I want to show a daughter how to press flowers and tell her stories about her grandmother. I want our family to grow." Matthew's face lit up with a joy so pure it took her breath away. "I want that too," he said, reaching for her hands. "I want all of it. Children, grandchildren, a house full of love and laughter and the controlled chaos that families bring. I want to build something that will last long after we're gone." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, both of them contemplating the magnitude of what they were discussing. A year ago, Annie had been resigned to spending her life alone. Now she was planning for children, for expansion, for a future bright with possibility. "There's one more thing," Matthew said eventually, his voice carrying a note of shy pride. "Something I've been working on in the evenings when you thought I was just whittling." He disappeared into the workshop and returned carrying something wrapped in soft cloth. When he unfolded it, Annie gasped to see a beautifully carved wooden cradle, its rockers curved to perfect smoothness and its sides decorated with delicate mountain flowers. "I started it after we talked about children the first time," Matthew explained, his cheeks reddening slightly. "Figured it would be good to have it ready just in case." Annie ran her fingers over the smooth wood, marveling at the care that had gone into every joint and curve. Like everything Matthew made, it was both functional and beautiful, designed to last for generations, and crafted with love that showed in every detail. "It's perfect," she whispered, imagining the babies who might someday sleep within its protective embrace. "Absolutely perfect." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, the sound of approaching horses announced yet another visitor to their mountain home. But this time, instead of lawyers or mining officials, they saw Sarah Hutchins riding up the trail with a basket strapped to her saddle and a smile that suggested purely social intentions. "I brought you the school board's official invitation," Sarah announced, as she dismounted, producing an envelope from her basket. "They're unanimous in their desire to have you as assistant teacher, Annie. The position comes with a salary of $30 a month and the respect of the entire community." Annie accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. $30 a month represented financial security beyond anything she'd known in her adult life, and the respect Sarah mentioned was worth even more than the money. "There's no pressure to decide immediately," Sarah continued, "but I did want you to know that several families have specifically requested that their children be placed in your classes. It seems your reputation for fairness and intelligence has spread beyond what you might have realized. After Sarah departed with promises to return for dinner later in the week, Annie and Matthew found themselves alone again, with their dreams and plans, and the comfortable certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "So," Matthew said, pulling her into his arms as the afternoon sun warmed their faces, "Teacher Colburn Rigg, mother of our future children, partner in all our adventures, are you ready for whatever comes next?" Annie looked around at the homestead they'd improved together, the foundation stones that would support their expanded home, the mountains that had witnessed their journey from lonely strangers to devoted partners. She thought about the pressed flowers that still decorated their cabin walls, the completed quilt that graced their marriage bed, the wooden spoon that hung in their kitchen, all symbols of the love they'd built one careful piece at a time. "I'm ready," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I'm ready for all of it." And as the mountain wind whispered around them like a blessing, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of endless tomorrows, Annie Colburn Rigg knew with absolute certainty that some stories end not with dramatic revelations or world-changing events, but with the quiet satisfaction of two hearts finally finding their way home to each other. Sometimes the greatest adventures happened in the smallest spaces, between two people brave enough to believe that love could indeed conquer all, even the fear of being truly, completely known and chosen.